All right, so tonight we're looking at our second archetype. We did the warrior archetype a couple weeks ago. Remember, there's 4 of them. Tonight is number 2. We'll do the next 2, obviously, when we come back from break. And want us to think back to that warrior type and then sort of see the differences that we see in this new one. This is our love archetype. And so we're still following with Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's book. And again, I'm sort of distilling down what this long chapter has about this archetype so that you sort of get the highlights and main ideas that's easy enough for us to wrap our brains around here, okay? So, the warrior archetype, remember, very physical. We just read a book, Once a Runner, that is very heavy on the emphasis of the body, right? The physicality of what it takes to be a high-level athlete, what your body goes through. So sort of compare that or contrast it with this archetype, which is definitely not so much about what goes on with your physical body, but more so what goes on with your emotions, your spirit, your mentality. Very different, obviously. So let's look at a couple descriptions that Moore and Gillette offer us. This is what they say. This is an archetype where perception and sensitivity to our environment is part of human nature, as is bonding with other people. So remember, when we talk about the warrior archetype, we're talking about something that it's part of who we are. All right, this is natural stuff. It's not something we had to invent. This is part of our biological makeup from what we are, what God has created us to be. And so we have within us this warrior component, but we also have in it this very different component, which is the capacity for love and that sensitivity and perception to the world around us. They highlight the adjectives nouns: vividness, aliveness, and passion. These are characters that feel things very intensely. All right. Again, you have these notes in your files for this class, so you don't have to jot things down that you don't want to. When we think of characters that would exhibit this from a literary standpoint, if you know anything about Greek mythology, Dionysus, he's a character that sort of indulges in everything in life. King Solomon, of course, tries everything. Sam from Lord of the Rings, he's a very sensitive soul who takes care of his friend Frodo, right? He loves poetry and that connection with people. Of course, Romeo and Juliet constantly talk about their feelings and how overwhelmed they are by what they feel for that other person. The character Tom in 500 Days of Summer, he's a very romantic guy. He's always thinking romantically. Most of Jane Austen's women, though not necessarily all of them, but many of them are on this quest for this true love, this ultimate feeling of what a relationship should be. Most rom-com characters, that's really what it comes down to. And then I also think Buddy the Elf, he would be in the lover archetype. Remember, if you know Elf, he loves everything. He's so excited and happy about everything, right? I'm in love, and I don't care who knows it, right? He loves coffee and candy and Christmas and Santa and decorations and his dad. And even when people don't love him back, he's just so happy to see people all the time. He wants to experience the world and take in everything through his senses, right? So this is what we're talking about with this lover archetype. It's someone who has a special level of sensitivity to them, that they want to experience what the world has to offer and have their feelings heightened. That's to them what they get the most pleasure out of and how they experience the world. So there's a few characters to think about. So of course, these are people who enjoy life's pleasures and can access various forms of love. And that's why I selected the materials for you tonight, is because, of course, love can have many different meanings, and we know that from Scripture, of course. And so we're going to talk about some of those from our pieces from today. So just like the warrior, well, what's the purpose? What do we get out of these actions from this type of archetype? Remember, the warrior it's because this is what defends your civilization. This is why these actions are important. Well, the actions for the lover archetype it's how life is enjoyed, and we are designed to enjoy what God has created for us, and so it's okay to experience the world and take it in. It's part of who we are. Okay, so remember again when we're talking about these archetypes, Moore and Gillette call it acting in fullness. This is what it means to have your, in this case, our emotions or our behaviors aligned properly with what allows you to be the best version of yourself according to this archetype that you can be. Okay, if you're going to act properly in the world in this way, these are the characteristics that they argue you should probably have, right? So of course these people are compassionate and empathetic. These are people who, you want obviously as your friends. They take care of other people. They feel what you're feeling. We'll talk more about that. Because of that, they feel connection with others, as opposed to, remember we talked about the warrior has to keep his distance, because if you're going to do something physical or violent, you can't get emotionally attached to everything, otherwise you can't do what needs to be done. These people are the opposite. They feel the bonds with people in a variety of ways. They like that oneness. Similar to the warrior, remember we said the warrior, because of their physicality, it's not always an intellectual exercise with them. Their job is to fulfill a duty, to perform the function of being the warrior. For these folks, it's not the physical element, it's the feeling. So it's still not very intellectual. These are people who go off their emotions more than their reasoning, you might say. Of course, these are folks that appreciate aesthetics. So Moore and Gillette would classify people who are connoisseurs of things. So whether it's, you're someone who really enjoys art and going to museums or going to the symphony, maybe you really appreciate the differences in types of coffee, the aesthetic, the different smells and the different tastes that you get from these different beans or whatever. They would even classify if you're a devoted car lover and you really appreciate how certain engines are built and how certain design features of the car have changed over time or something like that. So the aesthetic quality is something that this archetype is very attuned to. Again, because it gives them a sense of engaging in the world in a way that is emotionally satisfying, right? If there's a beauty in it and a pleasure in it, then that's how they want to experience things. And so appreciating aesthetics are very important to these characters. Now, I gave the example of Buddy the Elf, but these are also people who, while living a life in joy, because they're looking for all the positive things of life, they also have the other side where they'll often dwell in some of the pains of life. So, these are people who, when you're happy, they're happy for you, but when you're sad, they're going through sadness with you. That's the kind of empathic part of them. So these are people, because of their emotional life, there can be these swings, right? And sometimes that's good. In a friendship, of course, that's quite good. We'll talk in a second how those can go a bit too far. So unlike the warrior, if you remember, the warrior, because of they often have a sense of duty. Their actions are usually intended to bring some sort of order to something that's not right, that's a little bit chaotic. The other archetypes we're going to talk about as well tend to bend towards structure and order. They're trying to make sense of the world in a certain way. The lover archetype might not always do that. They're the ones, because of their emotional lives, are very free-spirited. They might not care so much about things being completely orderly all the time. They're the ones who, to use the rom-com cliche, will follow their heart. It's like, oh, okay. They're off on the flights of fancy, which that's part of it, and sometimes that might be okay. But that does distinguish them as being slightly different from the other three archetypes that we're going to cover. Also, hunches and intuitions, rather than logic and reasoning guiding how you behave. These are folks not only with their emotions, but their emotions often have these intuitions that they get a feeling, and that's how they decide what actions to pursue. So when I think of this, I think, I'm not a huge rom-com fan. There are a few that I like. I like Sleepless in Seattle. I like the movie Serendipity. Both of those movies, very much the characters, they even say it occasionally, where it's like, I just have a feeling that this is going to work. And we're meant to be, and fate is bringing our hearts together, and these kinds of ideas. And it's a bit out there romantically, you might say, but that's this intuition, like I just got a hunch that this is going to work and we're meant to be, and we're going to make a connection because I feel it. Might not even make sense logically, but this is where this archetype tends to dwell, in the intuition realm. Okay, so remember when we talked about the warrior, there's also this shadow side, right? There's a dark side where, while this is good, we should engage with the world. We should let our emotions run free from time to time. We should heighten our experiences when we can, because we are sensory creatures. God gave us perceptions to enjoy things and to pay attention to things, so that's good. But just like the warrior, it can also cause you some problems. So in the warrior, remember the shadow part of it was, these can usually go bad in two ways. One, remember the warrior, you can become too aggressive, and now you're being violent with all sorts of people when you don't need to be. Or the complete polar opposite of that is, you're a weakling and a coward. You have no warrior archetype in you. You're empty of warrior archetype. So here, this can go too far, or it could be absent, and so that shows up in a couple ways. So this is where someone who's an addict would come in, because they don't see a limit to whatever sensory or perceptual experience they're having. This can be, whether it's alcohol or drugs, or something like gambling, or even falling in love, supposedly, right, too quickly. This is where you get in so deep that you can't think there's any other way it could go. Like this has to be right because I feel so strongly about it. Like, no, you might just be addicted to whatever that is. You might be addicted to a person. You might be addicted to some substance that makes you feel a certain way. But whatever emotions and feelings you're having, you're becoming addicted to those feelings, and that is obviously not a good thing. Obviously, this leads to things like some obsessive qualities. You develop the inability to detach from your feelings. So again, in contrast to the warrior, who sort of had to be that way, and it's very hard to get those warrior characters to feel things. These characters feel things so much that you can't get them to stop feeling. And so that obsessive quality ultimately, leads to a form of idolatry, where you're placing that thing, whatever it is that you have that emotional addiction to, as your highest value. And of course, that's not a good thing, right? So Moore and Gillette referred to a character that this sometimes inhabits as the mama's boy character. I argue it's also the opposite of that, which would be the daddy's girl. These are people who have an emotional attachment that can lead to unhealthy attachments in other parts of their life, right? Big red flag whenever, especially an adult male, claims that he's a mama's boy, or if the mom says of her adult son, oh, he's a mama's boy, like, you should run away from that person. They might be a very nice person, but I would not get involved with that person. Same thing with the daddy's girl. If someone is if you're a kid, whatever, but at an adult age where you're supposed to be able to discern what kind of loving relationships you should be in, and you're always looking to what you envision the perfect relationship or the perfect loving model is, that can cause you some problems, because your future husband is not your dad. Your future wife is not your mom. Those are different forms of love. And if you're equating all of them as this idealized form, which is what they explain as what the mama's boy tends to do, that can be pretty unhealthy. So think why, if you ever watch Everybody Loves Raymond, that sitcom, I mean, he's too attached to his mom, right? That's why there's friction between he and his wife, and they get into these little spats that rom-coms, sitcoms do. Like you have to have some separation. You got to be able to say, this is one loving relationship, and that's what that is. This is another one, that's what that is. I treat them, sometimes they're similar, but they're different, and I can be mature enough to know the differences. This person can't quite figure that out usually. In literary examples, Jay Gatsby might be this person. If you've read Great Gatsby, he has such idealized visions of Daisy, his love from his teen years, his early years, that he reorganizes his whole life to try to impress her later on, and she's not worth impressing, and that's the problem. Is he's sort of addicted to this version of her that he thinks he loves, and if you know how that book ends, it gets him in some trouble. So that's a pretty relevant example because that book is so famous. There's a book by Goethe, German author from the late 1700s, 1790s, I think it was, called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And this character is sort of in a love triangle. He loves this girl, but she loves this other guy. And he tries to be friends with the guy to be closer to the girl. And ultimately it ends horribly, tragically. And so again, he's a guy who can't understand that the relationship he's seeking isn't reciprocated, and he's addicted to her. He's addicted to the feeling of being with her, and it's what makes everything fall apart. The emotional quality of this, very interestingly enough, there was an effect afterward called the Werther effect, or Werther syndrome, I think it kind of go either way, where young people, they would read this book, would find themselves feeling the same things, and then they'd end up in the same tragic consequences. And so there was this rash of horrible things that happened to young people because they had been reading this book. And so there was a big panic about, look at what literature and art does to people. It makes them feel too much. And, that book, people didn't like the book for a long time. And so this is what art and literature and stories do, is they make us feel things, even if it's fictional. It's not even real, and yet people acted it out in a real way, and that wasn't good. I would argue that is the point of literature, is to show us these examples where things go wrong so we can learn, don't do that. This is a model for what not to do. So instead of running away from it, I think they should have gone the other way and said, yeah, that's a really sad story. Let's learn from it so we don't act like that. So those would be examples of people being kind of overly addicted in their feelings and their loving relationships that aren't as real as they think. So the other way that you could kind of go wrong with the lover archetype is someone who doesn't take pleasure in anything, right? This is sort of a depressive mentality or personality, where you don't get any joy from life. You don't know how to experience things. You're not, you don't appreciate whether it's something beautiful or something that should be pleasurable. You have a disconnection and an isolation from it, and so you don't have much meaning in your life. The lover is very high on having meaning because it's so visceral for them. It's so emotional. It's easy to find meaning. A person who is the opposite, who doesn't have any love, who doesn't have any emotional connection, these are people who lack meaning and are disconnected from other people, and that's obviously not a good thing either. So these are sort of the two polar extremes that we don't want to land on. We want to always land in balance of, we want to have this archetype, but we also want to keep it in check so that it's benefiting us and helping us act properly in the world. So some examples from literature, not as famous as Jay Gatsby, but if you've read The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, one of my favorite books, Mr. Stevens, the main character of that book, he is very good at his job. He's a butler, but he doesn't allow himself to form connections with people. His job, he focuses solely on his job because he believes that's the best way to be who he is. And part of that is true, like you have to have focus to be good at something, but he also he's not able to participate in some of the other things of life that could bring him happiness and joy. And so he lets some of those positive things that he could have in his life slip away, and it's sort of a sad story, but it's a very good book. You should read it. And the movie is just as good. So watch the movie if you don't want to read the book. The Remains of the Day. Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson. Mr. Gradgrind from Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which after Tale of Two Cities, Hard Times is my second favorite Dickens novel. And Mr. Gradgrind is very entertaining because in his lack of having any sort of lover archetype, he is the schoolmaster, and he basically teaches children that there should be no imagination, no feelings, no attachment. All we learn here is the facts, and that's all that matters in the world. And so that way of teaching and way of raising his own children really distorts them and causes them some problems later in the novel. But these are men in this case who have sort of removed themselves from the possibility of feeling things and interacting with the world in any way that would bring joy and pleasure on a perception level, a sensory level, and it's obviously causes problems in those books. So that's sort of the lover archetype in a nutshell. That's a distillation of what Moore and Gillette cover in their chapter. When we think of this idea of love, we'll look at some other examples that I've brought as well as our texts that we looked at for today. But when we think of Scripture, obviously the Bible is filled with how we define love or how we should act out this loving way, how to be a person who loves properly. Obviously 1 Corinthians and even John 3:16, that God so loved the world. Like, love is everywhere, especially throughout the New Testament. My favorite passage in Scripture is John chapter 15. It's the vine and branches chapter. And it's towards the end of that chapter. And I've talked about this, I think I talked about it a little bit when I discussed A Tale of Two Cities. But the end of this chapter is what I think really ties everything together, and Christ himself describes it. So in chapter 15 of John, in verse 9, Christ is talking, and he says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love." Again, back to the vine and branches, like there's a connection. You have to stay in this place in order to maximize what God's love is, so that we all can experience it. "I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you." And then here's the line I love so much: "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." So when you think about laying down your life, hopefully we're never in a position where we have to necessarily physically do that. But laying down your life can mean just giving your full commitment to somebody, which is, being supportive and compassionate and protective, and whatever it means to connect with that person in a way that you feel like I am one with you, and I'm going to go through this with you, and I'll give anything you need to help uplift you, to act like Christ towards you. And so, of course, when I've talked about it in other classes, that idea of sacrifice, that's what Christ does for us, and that's what we can do for other people. And so it's the idea of laying down your life for someone. That's what you should do for your children. That's what you should do for your spouse. That's what you can do for your friends, where you say, I will do anything to help you. I will sacrifice myself because I see God in you, and I want to show God's love towards you. And that is why I believe this is such an amazing verse, and why it's my probably favorite verse in all of Scripture, actually. So I think when it comes down to this lover archetype, it's about, from a literary standpoint, it's about being very sensitive to your environment, paying close attention, being open to experience. But when it comes to other people, really I think what we're aiming at, and hopefully what we see with the examples that I asked you to take a look at today, it's really about how are these people showing Christ towards other people? Whether it's your spouse, like the Chris Spielman example I had you look at, whether it's towards a good friend, like with I Am Third, or whether it's in how you show your faith towards God, as in Eric Liddell's story. There are a variety of ways to do it, but really, what are you doing? You're laying down your life for someone else. And I don't know if there's a better definition of love than that. So with that, let's take a look at some of the things that you explored for tonight.